The conference room was so quiet after my CEO said the words that I could hear the air conditioner humming above us. 23 people were sitting around the glass table, and every one of them was looking at me. Daniel Mercer, the CEO of Northbridge Solutions, leaned back in his chair and folded his hands as if he had just finished making a routine business decision. "You are no longer part of this company," he said, effective immediately. I stared at him for a moment, trying to understand how a sentence could erase 11 years of my life so casually. My name was still printed on the presentation screen behind him. The presentation was for the largest contract Northbridge had ever pursued, a deal worth more than $80 million. I had spent 18 months helping build it. Daniel knew that. What he did not know was that the final approval depended on something only I had access to. I slowly closed the folder in front of me and stood. I did not argue. I did not beg. I did not ask him why. That seemed to disappoint him more than anger would have. "You should clear your desk before 5, he said. I looked around the room one last time. Some coworkers avoided my eyes. A few looked embarrassed. My closest colleague, Megan, looked genuinely shocked. Then I smiled. Not because I was happy, because Daniel had just made the biggest mistake of his career. I joined Northbridge when the company was still operating, from a small office above a furniture store. At the time, Daniel was not the polished executive everyone knew. He was ambitious, impatient, and brilliant enough to convince people that every impossible target was simply an ordinary target that had not been attacked hard enough. I respected that version of him. I became a contracts analyst, then moved into strategic accounts. Over the years, I learned how Northbridge worked from the inside. I knew which promises salespeople made without checking with operations. I knew which legal clauses could delay a contract for months. I knew which executives at major clients cared about price and which cared more about reliability. Most importantly, I learned how to listen. That skill eventually brought me into contact with Meridian Industrial. The company Northbridge had been trying to win for nearly 2 years. Meridian was enormous. They had facilities across the country, thousands of employees, and a reputation for being almost impossible to satisfy. Their procurement department had rejected 3 Northbridge proposals before finally agreeing to a pilot project. I became the person responsible for coordinating that pilot. For 18 months, I worked with Meridian managers, Northbridge engineers, lawyers, finance teams, and executives. I spent weekends reviewing contract revisions. I joined calls at 6 in the morning because Meridian had teams in 3 time zones. I even flew to Chicago during a snowstorm because their operations director wanted to walk through a facility before approving the final implementation plan. It was exhausting, but it was also the best work I had ever done. Then Daniel decided the deal needed a different face. His nephew, Ryan, had joined Northbridge 8 months earlier. Ryan was 29, confident, charming, and completely inexperienced in complex enterprise contracts. Daniel introduced him as the future of the company. At first, I tried to help him. I showed him the Meridian account history. I explained the unresolved issues. I gave him notes from previous negotiations and warned him about a particular clause involving data ownership. Ryan barely looked at the documents. "You worry too much," he told me. "These people want the deal as badly as we do." I knew that was not true. Meridian wanted the right deal, not simply any deal. A few weeks later, Daniel reassigned the account leadership to Ryan. Was told I would remain involved behind the scenes. That phrase should have worried me. Behind the scenes meant doing the work without receiving credit. Ryan began presenting my analysis to senior leadership as his own. When he needed numbers, he asked me. When Meridian pushed back, he asked me what to say. When the board requested updates, I prepared the information, and Ryan presented it. I kept my head down. I believed the contract mattered more than recognition. Then I discovered something Ryan had missed. Meridian had changed its procurement strategy. They were no longer choosing a vendor based primarily on cost. Their new requirement was based on continuity. They needed proof that the vendor could maintain the same operational standards during a leadership transition. That requirement was buried in an appendix attached to the original request for proposal. Almost nobody had read it. I had. The appendix contained a condition called the Continuity Assurance Clause. Meridian would only sign the final agreement if the person responsible for their implementation strategy remained directly accountable through the first 12 months. That person was me. I was listed by name in their internal approval documentation. At first, I thought it was a minor administrative detail. Then Meridian sent me a message. The message came from Laura Bennett, their senior procurement director. She asked me to confirm that I would remain the designated transition lead. I did not answer immediately. I went to Daniel. We need to discuss something in the Meridian contract. I told him. He barely looked up from his laptop. Ryan handles Meridian now. This affects the final approval. I said, then you can explain it to Ryan. I tried again. Daniel finally looked at me. You need to understand something, Emily. Senior leadership is about knowing when to step aside. The irony almost made me laugh. I had spent years protecting the company from mistakes made by people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Now the man making the biggest mistake was sitting across from me. I decided to document everything. I saved the approved contract drafts I was authorized to retain. I organized the correspondence that established my role. I kept copies of the internal approval records and the meeting notes showing that Meridian had repeatedly requested my involvement. Did not do this to sabotage Daniel. I did it because I knew that if something went wrong, everyone would suddenly ask who had known what and when. Then came the meeting. Daniel called it a leadership review. I thought we were going to discuss the final Meridian presentation. Instead, Daniel used the meeting to fire me. He accused me of resisting organizational changes and creating confusion by continuing to communicate with Meridian. That was not true. Meridian had contacted me directly because I was still listed as their transition lead, but Daniel had already decided on the story. He wanted everyone in the room to believe I had become difficult and disloyal, so he fired me in front of the entire leadership team. Walked out with my laptop bag and a cardboard box someone from administration had brought to my desk. Megan followed me into the hallway. Emily, what just happened? I put the box on my desk. Daniel has made his decision. But the Meridian deal? I looked at her. Do you know who their final approval team expects to be on the implementation call? She hesitated. You? I nodded. Megan stared at me. Does Daniel know? I smiled faintly. He thinks I was replaceable. I packed the last of my things and left. Outside the building, I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes. I expected to feel furious. Instead, I felt strangely calm because Daniel had just removed me from the company before Meridian had signed. That meant I was no longer responsible for protecting a deal controlled by people who refused to listen, but I was still the person Meridian trusted. The next morning, I received a call from Laura Bennett. I was expecting your message, she said. I am sorry, but I am no longer with Northbridge. There was a pause. That is precisely why I am calling. She explained that Meridian had received Northbridge's final proposal. Ryan had presented himself as the new account leader, but Meridian's legal team had noticed something missing. My name. Their contract required continuity through implementation. Northbridge had removed me without informing them. Laura asked whether I had been replaced. Told her the truth. Yes, she sighed. Then we have a problem. 3 days later, Meridian scheduled an emergency meeting. Northbridge executives attended. So did Ryan. So did Daniel. I was invited as an independent consultant. When I entered the conference room, Daniel looked genuinely surprised. Emily, I nodded politely. Daniel pulled me aside before the meeting. You need to be careful, he whispered. I am always careful. You are making this personal. I looked at him. You fired me in front of 23 people. His jaw tightened. That was a business decision. So is this, we entered the room. Laura began the meeting by explaining Meridian's position. We remain interested in Northbridge, she said, but the current transition plan does not meet the conditions of our approval committee. Ryan interrupted. We can easily assign another implementation lead. Laura looked at him. That person does not have 18 months of account knowledge. Ryan opened his mouth. Daniel stepped in. We can guarantee continuity. Laura turned toward me. Emily, would you be willing to lead the transition if Meridian selected Northbridge? The room became silent. Daniel stared at me. This was the moment he had never imagined. I could have said no. Part of me wanted to. But I knew the decision was bigger than revenge. I looked at Laura. Would consider it under one condition. Daniel leaned forward. What condition? I want the implementation plan reviewed independently. Before Meridian signs, Laura nodded immediately. Agreed, Daniel. Looked furious. But he had no choice. The review began the following week. That was when the second problem appeared. Ryan had changed several technical assumptions in the proposal. Those changes reduced the initial cost and made Northbridge look more competitive, but they also created operational risks that Meridian had specifically warned about. I had documented those risks months earlier. Ryan had ignored them. When Meridian's engineering team questioned the numbers, Ryan could not explain them. Daniel tried. I stepped in only when Laura asked me directly. The original model assumed 3 regional support centers. The revised model uses 1 centralized center. That reduces cost, but it increases response time for facilities on the West Coast. The engineer looked at Ryan. Why was that changed? Ryan looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me. Nobody spoke. I continued. The original configuration was based on Meridian's service level requirement. If Northbridge wants to use the centralized model, the contract needs to be rewritten. Laura closed her folder. That means the current proposal is not acceptable. Daniel's face changed. We can revise it. How quickly? 2 weeks, he said. We need it in 5 days. Laura replied. Daniel looked at me. Emily can help. I said nothing. Laura smiled. She already is. For the next 5 days, I worked with Meridian's team as an independent consultant. Did not work for Northbridge. I did not report to Daniel, and I did not. Answer to Ryan, I simply helped Meridian determine whether the proposal they were considering was actually workable. During those 5 days, I discovered something else. Northbridge had built its entire implementation schedule around assumptions that were no longer valid. The project would have failed within the first 90 days. I prepared a revised transition plan. It cost more, but it was realistic. Meridian approved it. Then Laura made the announcement. Daniel had been waiting for, Meridian was ready to sign. But there was a condition. They wanted me appointed as their independent transition advisor. Northbridge could remain the primary vendor, but I would oversee implementation for the first year. Daniel stared across the table. You want her running the project? Laura nodded. She is the reason the project is still viable. The contract was signed. 2 days later, $84 million. Northbridge received the deal. But Daniel did not get the victory he expected because the board had been informed about what happened. Meridian's executives had made it clear that removing me had nearly destroyed the contract. The board opened an internal review. Ryan was removed from the account. Daniel was not fired immediately. Instead, the board stripped him of direct control over strategic accounts while they reviewed his leadership decisions. 3 months later, Daniel resigned. I heard about it from Megan. She called me one afternoon while I was sitting in a Meridian conference room reviewing implementation milestones. Did you hear? Hear what? Daniel resigned. I leaned back in my chair. How is Ryan? He left 2 weeks ago. I smiled. Then Megan said something I never expected. The board asked me to come back. I laughed. You are kidding. They want me to lead strategic client operations. Thought about it for a moment. Then I declined. Not because I hated Northbridge, not because I wanted to punish anyone. I simply realized that I had spent 11 years waiting for people inside that building to recognize my value. I did not need them to anymore. A month later, I started my own consulting firm. My first major client was Meridian. My second came through a recommendation from Laura. Within a year, I had a small team of people who had once been overlooked in larger companies, people who were good at their jobs but rarely received credit. Hired them because I knew what it felt like to be useful and invisible at the same time. Sometimes, I still think about that conference room. Remember Daniel looking at me when he said I was no longer part of the company. At the time, he believed he was removing a problem. He did not realize he was removing the person who understood the one thing his biggest deal could not survive without. But I learned something more important than that. The real victory was not watching Daniel lose his position. It was realizing that my value had never depended on his permission. He could take away my title, he could take away my desk, he could embarrass me in front of an entire room. But he could not erase the trust I had built. the knowledge I had earned, or the reputation I had created through 11 years of doing the work properly. And when the biggest deal in Northbridge history finally closed, my name was not on the company press release. It did not need to be. The people who mattered already knew exactly who had made it possible.